We know that democratic words and forms have been written into laws. But it is the way people practice democracy that really counts.
This is it. In thinking seriously of democracy, one must define his words carefully and use them consistently. When you have your own definitions clear, you know exactly what to look for in a community.
Many students agree that two important signs of democracy are shared respect and shared power. Let's take shared respect first.
For more than 500 years, American Indian people have been subjected to the ever-changing whims of the white man, who with sword in one hand and Bible in the other, swept across this land like a plague of locusts.
The struggle for black people is an old, old struggle for full citizenship in our country. Its angers, its revolts were ignored and forgotten.
Hitler's concept of concentration camps, as well as the practicality of genocide, owed much, so he claimed, to his studies of United States history, and he often praised to his inner circle the efficiency of America's extermination.
Because there are things more painful to people, more destructive than what happens to the body, but they're much harder to see. The fear, the confusion, the hopelessness, the quiet crying inside of people who are not allowed the basic rights of human dignity.
In their efforts to deal with the original inhabitants of this land, the European and then the American governments tried many different approaches. First they tried subjugation. Then when that failed, extermination. And when that wasn't totally successful, then came the reservations.
There are records of more than 100 successful slave revolts on the high seas. Men do not submit easily to chains, but their chains are not so easily broken either.
And the land set aside for reservations in the 1800s was generally the most worthless land that could be found. Indians were relocated to these lands for as long as the grass grows and the rivers flow.
What would you do if you were turned from human being into another man's property and treated like a beast of the fields? How would you feel? Even without reading or writing, even without the right to talk with each other in the fields, slaves found ways to express their pain and anger. What couldn't be said could be sung or shouted. A language of resistance the master could not understand, but is now a part of the cultural heritage of America. Because many believed what their great leader, Frederick Douglass, said.
I have held all my life, and shall hold to the day of my death, that the fundamental and everlasting objection to slavery is not that it sinks a Negro to the condition of a brute, but that it sinks a man to that condition.
They signed up the Indians who were assigned to that particular reservation. They took a roll, as it were, at that time. Everybody was given a number so that they could identify the people who were reservation-bound Indians, because reservations and the inception were no more than glorified concentration camps. Indians were forbidden to leave them. And so you were given your tribal identity right then and there by the United States government.
The roaring, rushing drive to own oneself was bigger than the fear of being caught or killed. The story of slavery in America is a story of dreadful oppression and of heroic resistance to that oppression. Our story began the day the first slave ship left Africa, and it cannot end until the last chain of slavery and its scars have disappeared from our land.
Political winds shifted and extermination began to fall out of favor. Assimilation became a new byword of a concerned citizenry, and so an educational model to make Indians into imitation white men was proposed. The centerpiece of this plan was the Indian boarding school system designed by former Indian fighter Captain Richard Pratt. His motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man," was the central philosophy which destroyed Indian families and societies by sexually violating and brainwashing generations of Indian children into believing that their language, culture, clothing, and their very identity was evil. In actuality, the effect of the boarding schools was far more devastating and far-reaching than its creators ever conceived. It is now recognized that the boarding school experience has affected multiple generations of Indian people with such symptoms as alcoholism, drug abuse, incest, sexual abuse, and other major dysfunctions. Almost every Indian person alive today, no matter how successful, carries the residual psychological scars of yesterday and must grapple with the question, when it's all over, will I be Indian or white?
It's a little known part of history, but it is a reality. And nobody's ever really addressed it. Nobody's ever really talked about the Holocaust here. I mean, there were conservative figures, 19 million Indian people living in North America. 19 million. And by 1970, there were 260,000. They didn't move to Hawaii, you know, or they didn't go to Sweden. Where did they go? They are gone. They were gone. Killed. Murdered. But 19 million people. Well, that's not a Holocaust.
This is our symbol. It's an Indian mother, a Spanish father, and a cat with a mustache facing it. On one side of us, we predate Plymouth Rock 20,000 years. On the other side, 300. Yet we're told to identify with what's coming from the eastern seaboard. But again, you say, well, that's past. It has nothing to do with us today. But it has a lot to do with us today. It has a lot to do with us, with the culture that our people have had is going to the graves with our old people. So that we have to start relating to who and what we are. It's not alienation, it's movement, self-determination. The Japanese, they have no political power, so to speak, because they're small numbers, yet they have economic control of their life, and what they develop, it goes into the majority society, but the money comes back into rich new blood for themselves to develop their own people. You know, this is because they control their church, they control their social life, and their whole living together. And I don't hear anybody saying the Japanese are alienated, but the minute a few black people get together, they say, man, those guys are bad. When Mexicans start to get it, they say, well, gee, they might think I'm a bad guy. You know, the hell with what they think. Because what they thought has created all the problems for the mass of our people. There wouldn't be any racism if his folks and his forefathers hadn't provoked it. There wouldn't be any discrimination if his forefathers hadn't provoked it and built upon it and created a status quo barrier to all other people. As we watch the black move, as we watch the radical Anglo move, we say, you know, where are we going? We've got it all right here. We don't have to go. We just have to preserve it and build it up. We have to defend it. We have to take care of these things that are important to our people. It's right here. It's right here in my hand. My feet are on the ground, and this is who I am, and I'm proud of it.
Sharing respect means that each shares the respect of all. One sign of shared respect in a community is that everybody is given a fair chance to develop useful skills. Shared power. Most observers agree that there is true democracy in a community only if there is shared power. That is to say, only if many people have a share in making decisions that the community will support. More specifically, you can say that power is shared wherever regular popular elections are authorized and are actually held.
I am, then, both visibly and legally, the descendant of slaves in a white Western country, kidnapped pagan who was sold like an animal and treated like one, who was once defined by the American Constitution as 3/5 of a man, and who, according to the Dred Scott decision, had no rights that a white man was bound to respect.
1950s, the federal government instituted yet another new Indian policy known as termination. The purpose of this policy? To eliminate tribal governments and tribal lands, along with any vestige of tribal identity, so that the Red Nation would become part of America's great melting pot.
These are refugees. They're not refugees from Mexico, they're refugees from displacement and from economic exploitation in the rural areas. And they've come to the cities to look for work.
The only thing white people have that black people need or should want is power. And no one holds power forever.
Whenever any group can vote in a bloc and decide the outcome of elections, and it fails to do this, then that group is politically sick. The cornerstones of this country's operations are economic and political strength, and the black man doesn't have the economic strength, and it will take time for him to build it. But right now, the American black man has the political strength and power to change his destiny overnight.
The Black Revolution, with its high drama, both inspired and somewhat obscured the more localized protests of Mexican-American groups. They are now demanding the rights of citizenship and full participation in the economic, political, and social life of this country.
Our own people.
Now the kids are learning different. They don't have to take abuse from anybody. They're as equal as anybody else in this God's country. Our kids are just as smart as anybody else's kids given the opportunities. And we wouldn't be fighting so hard if our parents before us would have done what we're doing for our children. But they always told us this is the way they are, this is the way we have to accept it. When I would come home and tell my dad, I was brought up in Brighton, went to school there, they were very prejudiced against Spanish and Mexicans. And I'd come home and tell my parents, and they say, well, this is the way it is, you have to accept it. We found out we don't have to accept it. And our kids are not going to. We're not going to settle for this for our kids. We're going to work with them and teach them our new way of life, which is our right. We have just as much right here as anybody else in this country, or more, because we funded it.
Program isn't in the hands of the people. The power, is at the top. It's held by a corporate elite, and that the country is organized to protect the corporate elite.